Okay, we were at the question how the global market affects the local one.
Yes.
It was the same thing as in previous cases. When we see a number of fluctuation which happens and occurs in various processes of exchanges, what we could see is that there are interlinkages between that. But I'm not the advocate of the view that there are two, or let's say, levels of reality: the global one and the local one. So let's say one exchange is quite a local thing, and it depends on how it is related to other stuff and which are the mediators. For example, what links that. This is why the some events related to globalization are so important. Let's say Washington Consensus and the emergence of U.S. dollar as, let's say, global currency. So you have one mediator which value and which power affects so many other entities which it relates as well. So for example, for some countries before the Ukraine crisis and before the pandemic, for example, to have any kind of a basic exchange, it depended on the value of dollar. What is expressed in the value of dollar. Therefore, when we're speaking about this relation between the global market, we're not just saying that there's some values or resources of global market, even though we should always be aware that there are a number of let's say institutions which intend to be global. So when we measure stuff, we measure it so that we have the same oil price elsewhere worldwide, right? And this is where we are capable of speaking about the global market. But local parts of that, let's say local parts, are terribly important. Let's say, for example, the exchange in Chicago, which is the biggest exchange in agricultural goods, is also important. What happens there? Who are the principal actors? Who are the principal stakeholders? How the people in those tiny little locations actually determine the quite intricate courses of global exchange change. So this is the point where we should, I think, abandon that binary thinking in the global and local, and be more specific and more precise how, where, and how something is being related. Also, nonetheless, we have the technological bounds which actually link us to a certain extent, and these number of these tiny little mediators that we use in economic exchange, in cultural exchange as well, but also in political processes that accompany globalization, are the ones that somehow intertwine. Okay.
Next question. To which economic class did globalization prove to be the most advantageous to?
This is actually quite an interesting question. Having in mind that various authors, one could remind, for example, Lessons Clare and his thesis in transnational capitalist class, and others, for example, economicists, let's say Branko Milanovic, is over this topic on who benefits the most from the globalization. I think that this is a two-way street in a way. So those who have accumulated goods are definitely those who are being popularly called and colloquially called as global elite, etc., and capitalists, etc., etc. But on the other hand, this is the thing on which class which classes also have large benefits. So in a certain extent, when we have let's say rise in living standards and let's say patterns of labor and specific locations in the world, we might see something where other classes which have been let's say deprivileged also see some kind of a benefits. They got new jobs, they got better let's say, employment opportunities, but they also have a bundle of other entities which come with the globalization. They got another, technological goods. They got bigger space for their own personal consumption. But outside that thinking, where on the level of the household, we have also something that has been a widely addressed topic in various discussions on globalization, and specifically I'm having in mind the late British geographer Doreen Massey, who explored how these processes of deindustrialization have actually also affected the people negatively. And this is quite popular topic among the neo-Marxist thinkers, is that to underline and to underscore how the dislocation of the production has affected negatively various locations in the world, which were previously, before that broad before the globalizing acceleration, have affected the classes who were, let's say, for a couple of generations stable in their class positions, specifically the industrial working classes of in the Western Europe and also in the Northwest of the United States. So the answer to this question could not be a monolith one, let's say, and could not be confined to one, specific claim. But various classes, depending on their interlinkages, not only on the global market and the division of global labor, but also in terms of how their, let's say, patterns of consumption are being constituted, are being affected in this or that way. So, for example, nowadays we see that a huge economic improvements that we witness nowadays in China or India have been possibly the biggest generators of global consumption of goods, such as fashion or some food, so on, and travel as well, for the uprising middle classes in India and China. So those latecomers to globalization are also facing what, for example, nowadays the established middle classes in the West are seeing as a possible decline. Branko Milanovic, in his latest book, is writing about that the middle classes in the West are now stagnating when it comes to income, for a simple reason, because the technology and technological links have enabled, again, to extract the cheap labor elsewhere. So somebody who has been employed in United States, for example, as a copywriter somewhere in Texas or Georgia, is stagnating because he has now a competition thanks to the internet, thanks to technological intermediaries somewhere else, for example, in Serbia. So, and of course, people in Serbia are far less paid than those in Atlanta, Georgia, looking compared in absolute terms, but for those in Serbia, the living standard is relatively rising, and for those in the United States is dropping. So the whole answer is quite intricate. It depends on which relation are we speaking about.
Yes, thank you. What is your opinion on the claim that under the influence of globalization is a change in the way of working?
This is I think the one of the principal changes that we are facing nowadays. As I was mentioning, those neo-Marxist authors have been setting the specific accent on the changes, on the patterns of division of labor, and the very reorganization, because number of corporations that have extended their operations worldwide ever since, let's say, 1980s specifically, have been seeing renewed and have refreshed, let's say, their patterns of operation. And these whole processes, where, for example, corporations are intending to make their work and labor more efficient, is also related to that global division of labor. So in order to enhance their, let's say, efficacy when it comes to, let's say, their final output, their product, you should always think where and how to organize your company. For example, we have here, and this is a good example actually, because it's close to us, is the USNCR, which also has offices here in Serbia, National Cash Registry, and this is the company which works in a couple of locations. So they work in Atlanta, Georgia, where they're originally from. They also work, I think, in Kolkata, India, and they work in Belgrade, Serbia. And these set of operations between these locations, this specific specialization in each of these. So the different experts, different kind of expertise you need is, I think, the principal thing which is, of course, of particular interest for each company to reduce its own cost of its productivity, but also is important to see how these divisions of labor actually affect the specific locations. Like, for example, to concentrate specific knowledge, specific skills, etc. Also, what I was saying about the global cities, it is quite interesting to underline that a number of authors who were writing about the global cities, Saskia Sassen among the first ones, also underscored that this concentration of skills, let's say cultural capital in specific locations, is also quite important when we speak about the division of labor. To put it shortly and briefly, in one specific location, what and how it links to other processes in globalization, we always have to think about what it, let's say, coalesces together. So, for example, you have, and we were speaking about that the other day in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, the place where the machines for producing of chips are located. So Eindhoven is, for example, nowadays seeking for more well-educated engineers which are specialized in the machines that will produce microchips. So it is a good example how it concentrates. Even though when we look at the urban economy in general, urban economies are quite complex. They have to also be linked. So when we speaking about the globe, we should also think what this tiny, let's say, mashes of various activities, such as the cities, also concentrate. For example, what is necessary to have a proper economy for global cities such as Amsterdam? So you have to have a huge airport. You have to have a lot of a working force that will work in the service sector to serve you, to produce food, to serve you and to cook for you. For example, you have to have other services like public transportation, and you also have to have what is being usually also associated to a global cities is an amusement, for example, in those cities. So it is quite complex division of labor, how it is linked in specific locations and how it links to other locations worldwide.
Yes, thank you. Does globalization influence on the increase or decrease in deviant behavior and crime? Do you want to answer on that, or
I'll try to answer, but I'll do my best since my knowledge in this topic is quite poor, and I'm not sure actually how to formulate this answer, since what is being usually spoken about is the mafia, for example, and illegal activities that are being widely enabled thanks to dismissal of the state borders and the lack of bordering practices that accompany the globalization. Therefore, I don't think that it necessarily comes something as under influence, even though we might see that that it is a broader processes of circulation of goods, such as narcotics, for example, which is something that is being a widely addressed topic nowadays, and this is something which also this expanding bonds of economic exchanges also enable. Therefore, I think that I should conclude quite tentatively, though, that the globalization does have particular influence on the emergence of such like practices.
Good one. Do you think that one of the results of globalization is homogeneity or heterogeneity? In which examples is this most visible?
I would, if we abandon thinking binaries, so either or. I think that the globalization contains both processes. It both homogenizes to a certain extent, even though it is something which some might see as quite shallow. For example, we might communicate with somebody who's from other culture on a quite basic level, right? So it homogenizes us, but also it is a huge point of heterogenization. So we're all a part of a global arena, and we're becoming more and more competitive to express our own identities. But when it comes to homogenization, this is quite important, let's say, for even for something that was seen as let's say a prototype of the urban global citizen or cosmopolitan citizen, let's say by Kant, is that that we all share some commonalities, something in common throughout the planet. And this is something which globalization specifically has engendered, or if not engendered, then fueled once more when we see a number of processes such as the gender equality, such as a number of other links that we, or cultural affinities that we bring to or develop towards other people. This is one of the principal effects of deglobalization, and this is one of the topics that is being, well, let's say, mostly discussed one when it comes to potential global citizenship, and whether the humanity as a whole has the same rights. Is it equitable? Is the distribution of goods equitable? And I think it is, at least at the level of idea, quite important effect of the globalization.
Thank you. How does globalization influence the consumption of certain society?
Well, we consume, and this is something that is being brought by the globalization to unprecedented scale and pace as well. And some of the authors who write nowadays about the climate change and the Anthropocene's particular as a specific geological epoch, are underlining these effects of the so-called Great Acceleration that emerged after the Second World War. Therefore, the consumption is usually something that we see as a principal effect of the globalization. This is something that is the closest thing to us. So we are having an access to various goods or let's say entities. So the entity might be my computer, the entity might be my sweater, but the entity might be a movie that they'll watch later this evening on Netflix. And the consumption is something that has been seen as a principal engine of the economic interdependency, but the consumption is also, to a certain extent, well, two-edged sword. It brings something which we see, which, for example, affects particularly the inequalities, the global inequalities worldwide, and also affects our ways and how we actually destroy our environment. So the consumption and the relation of specific, patterns, let's say, of globalization, it is quite a tricky thing to answer since it also involves various affects. So when we're speaking about that we should slow down our development, so that we against, for example, those excessive means of consumption, etc., in order, for example, to potentially reduce the effects of the climate change, we're always having that moral sense of that. Okay, but we are the principal consumers. Why the people from, let's say, Angola do not have the same access as we have had historically, exactly by consuming goods. But this is something which is, of course, being largely criticized under the banner of consumerism, which isn't only about the ways that people are, let's say, dummies that consume too much of something, like, say, Coca-Cola or other goods. It is also a ways of how other people that were involved into globalization have been affirming themselves through clothes, through ways of consumption, and have also been improving themselves and their potential as human beings as well. So it's quite intricate and hard to determine what and how do we have these effects of consumption, because they're enormous to a certain point, but again, on the other hand, they're also provoking different, let's say, epiphenomena, which we don't see immediately, such as the inequitable division of labor, so for example. So our living standard is actually generated by, well, let's say, not only extraction, but also exploitation of other human work, but also non-human work, because we, in order to have all the benefits for our living, we also exploit the non-human world immensely. So we exploit for example, to record this, we need lithium, and we exploit something from from geological layers to have our way of living, our living standard, etc.
Thank you. Oh my God. Would you agree with the Rammstein line that we all live in America?
No. This is something which well, let's say eagles from the White House would love to hear, that we live in America, even to a certain extent. But this was one of the most popular views on globalization during the 1990s, and for example, Early Beck was one of the most vocal opponents of this view, because this view actually sees quite well, let's say. In malicious way, I will say that in malicious way, sees that we all have some minimal common things in common, among others. But this is usually shallow and vague understanding of globalization, that we are all Americanized. Globalization, as we already have said, also induces various processes that are actually quite contrary to that. Because if we were living in the United States, we will not have enormous geopolitical conflicts, for example, and enormous misunderstanding, which is being brought and put forward by various skeptics, globalists, and anti-globalists as well.
I think this is Marco's question, not mine.
Okay.
He wanted to know your opinion about that.
Okay.
In your opinion, is the claim that higher percentage of people are now religious because of globalization content true or false?
Well, when you speak about the theoretical models of that that intend to link the religious ways of beliefs and the globalization as something as independent variable, and it's hard to make a clear statement about that, because on the one hand, there are large emergence of the secular process throughout the West. But also a huge emergence of various forms of religious affinities, let's call them that way. When we say religious affinities, it means that people are developing some kind of explications, for example, to understand the world around them, but also they express themselves in order to claim the identity against some other identity or some other forms of thinking. So, for example, and what is going on most recently are the re-emergence of quite radical movements, for example, radical Catholic movement, let's say in Poland, which also has the, let's say, a semen of that thinking against the something that is going on with the globalization. So globalization, in terms of relation to religion, is also a quite intricate one, in a sense where it helps religiosity to become more and more put aside, thanks to various other processes that might supplant some major authority, such as God. But on the other hand, it becomes one important force for even political mobilization of people against something that is being disperse thanks to globalization. So what we could hear nowadays is sentiments of the people who now desecularize themselves, is that they claim, for example, that it is the threat from the, let's say, West, it is the threat for our, well-being, and so on. And then you have also recalling one major authority, or calling some other some other identity. For example, what preceded this conflict in Ukraine was also had those religious components and also civilizational components, with Russians claiming that Eurasia is something specific. So it isn't something that Americans brought with their globalization. And this is something that was also largely held by the official religious institutions, such as Russian Orthodox Church, for example. So in that aspect, the globalization has many effects on the shape of religion and religious features nowadays. Let's not forget the fundamentalism and the emergence of the fundamentalism, which deliberately use that message to going against somebody's convictions, or somebody's lack of having a supreme authority. So the message of the fundamentalism is that my God is better than your God. If your God is, for example, a can of Coca-Cola, my God is, let's say, Allah, and is more powerful than yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. How globalization influenced the inequality?
Immensely. So this is also just 1 minute. So immensely, and I think mislim da ćete morati još, zato što sam rekao da ću ja zapričati. Tako da, ajde da zapravo hoćete da
Samo još da vidim koliko ja vremena imam.